Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Let's Rant with Scrapper playing Power Wash Simulator. This is the first real assignment after cleaning off our van. We're going to clean the back garden of this house at 213 Walnut Street in Muckingham. Yes, Muckingham is a pretty dirty town, and they're going to have lots of power washing for us to do. Let me just hang on here so I can get the sound correct. And it should be right, so let me just check it. And it is. So here we are in this yard, and we're going to be power washing the yard. By the way, there is equipment that you can get to replace the various elements here, but we don't have enough money to afford that yet. So we just have a 0, a 15, a 25, and a 40-degree nozzle. I usually use the 15. I feel like that one works pretty well for most things. And then sometimes they use the bigger ones to just finish washing off. So you can see we have this filthy yard. I've got to go all the way around the yard and do it. So one of the things I'm going to try to do, guys, sometimes when I mess with the controls, I forget. So I don't want to make you all seasick doing this. So I'm going to use the feature where you can swing the gun, the water shooter, without swinging the actual screen as much as possible. So we'll start with this little stuff, and then we'll move on to the bigger stuff as we go. And so we're going to rant, and today's topic is, should the GM be neutral? So that's the question, and this comes from a video I was watching where they were talking about a variety of things. It was primarily about whether it's okay for the GM to kill characters. And in the context of what they were saying, they argued, of course, the GM should be able to kill characters, but they said that, hang on, let me just turn my sound down a little bit. There we go. But they said that the GM shouldn't be necessarily trying to help them either, and that the GM should just be a neutral party who's just applying the rules fairly and just, kind of being like a referee in a game, right, where you're neutral and you're not trying to help one team or the other win. And so I wanted to talk about that and about whether, see if I got everything here. I think I have. And about whether that's true. Should the GM be neutral, or should the GM not be neutral? And I would actually argue that the GM should not be neutral, and that in fact the GM should favor one side over the other. That the side the GM should favor is the players. And so that's what I want to talk about today, is why that is, where I got that idea from, and why I stand by it. And I want to point out that a lot of my role-playing game philosophy comes from Champions, partly because of how much I played it, but also because Steve Peterson and George McDonald, when they wrote the Champions rules, were very good at giving advice to you as a game master to kind of tell you how to run the game, right? Very much in the vein of Matt Colville's quote-unquote running the game videos, where he's talking to you about the mechanics of running a role-playing game. The same kind of thing was done by Steve Peterson and George McDonald and the other people at Hero Games. And along with having that stuff in the books, they also had articles in Adventurers Club magazine, and I subscribed to it. It came out, I think, quarterly, and it was a really useful magazine. They had really cool articles in there, and many of them have stuck with me, and their wordings have stuck with me over the years. And so when I think about whether you should be neutral or not, or whether you should be like literally on the side of the players, what sticks out of my mind is an article that was actually about players who were not having their character act heroic. Okay, and they were talking about the problem player, really, who is, shall we say, acting more like a villain than like a superhero. And Hang on, it's not letting me stop crouching. There we go. And so they were sort of talking about what to do, and um, what they described was that the that if the players stop acting like heroes and start acting more like villains, then the GM is liable to treat them like villains. And then they asked this great question, right? They said, in most Champions games, the player characters win most of the time. The heroes almost always win, and the villains almost always lose. And they said, why is that? Why is it that the heroes, the player characters almost always win, and the villains almost always lose? And they said, well, the reason is that the player characters are heroes, right? They're good guys. They're self-sacrificing. They are, they're selfless. They are charitable. They're helping people. They're risking their lives to rescue kidnapped victims and defeat supervillains and save the cat, rescue the cat out of the tree and all the other things. Like, why do they win? Right? They're heroes, and because they're self-sacrificing heroes, the GM appreciates that as a human being. You appreciate other human beings who go out of their way to help people, right? And so whoever wrote this article, and I can't remember who it was Aaron Alston maybe, or Bruce Harlick, I can't remember, but whoever wrote this article said the player characters, the heroes, have something the villains ordinarily can never have: the GM's goodwill. That's why the heroes win. Because the GM wants them to win. And it's not that the GM is necessarily fudging rolls all the time, but as a GM, you purposely set up scenarios, like literally that's what they're called in Champions, scenarios. You purposely set up scenarios that are designed to enable or allow for the players to be victorious. You want them to win because they're the good guys, right? They're helping people. You don't actually want Dr. Destroyer to nuke the world. And so you're on the player's side when they invade the island of Dr. Destroyer and try to take him down, right? And Dr. Destroyer doesn't have the GM's goodwill, even though the GM may have made him up, right? He doesn't have the GM's goodwill because he's doing bad stuff. Right? And so what they said in this article is, if the heroes start doing bad stuff, then they lose the game master's goodwill. The GM has no reason to stack the scenario in favor of the player characters if they're just as bad as the villains. And so that's what they were kind of talking about in terms of whether, what happens to players who are playing villainous heroes, essentially, right? Heroes that aren't being ethical or heroic. Can I grab this thing? The Twitches thing is getting in the right place to pick up the ladders and the stools and stuff. So what they were essentially saying is that the GM is not a neutral party ordinarily, right? That the GM is actually going to be on the side of the heroes. He's not necessarily fudging dice, or she is not necessarily fudging dice. They're not necessarily cheating against the villains, but they want the heroes to win, and they kind of design the adventure, the scenario, etc., for the heroes to be victorious. And that's kind of the default assumption of a Champions game. Okay? And then they were just talking about what happens when you lose the goodwill of the GM. But my point is, if that's true, and the GM the players have the GM's goodwill, then no, the game master is not a neutral third party, just sort of arbitrating as a completely impartial referee between the heroes and the villains. The GM wants the heroes to win, right? The GM is on the side of the heroes, but also being somewhat neutral, right? You're in this sort of awkward, almost like being a hometown referee, right? Where you're sort of, your instinct is to root for the home team, but you've got to be fair, right? So you'd like to see the home team win, but you can't cheat to make them win, right? You're just hoping they'll win. And it's the same thing with the GM. You're hoping the player characters will win, and you want them to. And you may even, unlike a referee who can't do this, you may even stack the deck a little bit so that the players will win. And there's not only isn't there anything wrong with that, but I would argue, and the Champions guys would argue, you should be doing that, right? Because the players are the good guys, and they are on the side of right and the innocent and protecting people and so on. But if they stop doing that, then they lose the GM's goodwill. So what I would argue is that no, the game master should not be a completely neutral arbitrator. The game master should be on the side of the players as long as the players are having their characters act in heroic ways or in ways that make sense for the campaign. I mean, after all, if you're playing villains, then you don't expect the players to act like heroes, right? But in most cases, D&D and Deadlands and Star Wars role-playing game and stuff, in most cases you're playing the good guys, and you expect the player characters to be self-sacrificing and honorable and that sort of stuff. As long as they are, then many game masters are going to be on their side, because we tend to favor the heroic people, right? Because they're doing good stuff. So no, you don't need to be neutral as a game master. And you can, in fact, stack the deck and be on the player side. That doesn't mean you don't make it a challenge, right? You certainly still want to make it a challenge. You know how I like challenges. But you can be challenging to the players, but still kind of try to set the challenge up so that the players will probably win, right? And the reason you do that is because you appreciate the heroic nature of the player characters, right? So that implies that the players are going to be heroic, right? That the characters will be heroic. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk about that. I mean, I think there's a fine line to walk, right? You can't just, as I said, you're not going to be fudging dice and that sort of thing. You don't want to make it easy and make it so that every challenge is just easily overcome, because then the players won't respect the game and the challenges, right? But it's perfectly normal and okay and fairly typical for game masters to stack the deck, as it were, in terms of how they set up the scenario, right? I mean, in all the years I played Champions, I can only think of maybe like 2 or 3 times when the player characters the heroes didn't win. It was extremely rare. And the reason is that all of the player characters were heroic, pretty much, and so they had the GM's goodwill, right? And so, I mean, I remember, like, my best friend, the first big group we had, the Crusaders, in the very first scenario, he overdid the villains, and it was too hard. And I remember we had to retreat from that battle, and then try to take out the villains piecemeal. And I mean, he let us do that, right? Like he had the villains sort of act stupidly, and even though they had us on the ropes in in a group, he had them like kind of be dumb and break up so that they attacked us piecemeal instead of as one unit. And that was probably dumb of them. In fact, it was dumb of them. Uh, is this everything? Looks like it. But why did he do that? Because we had his goodwill. We were the heroes, and he wanted the heroes to win, right? And so this is the point that Aaron Olson or whoever it was that wrote this article was trying to make. That if the heroes have the GM's goodwill, then they're usually going to win. And if they're usually winning, it's because they're heroes, right? And so that implies that the GM is not a completely neutral arbitrator. And that in fact, the GM is on the side of the heroes because they're heroes. And so I guess that's what I wanted. That's mostly what I wanted to talk about today. We're only about 16 minutes in, so we'll keep going. But let me know in the comments whether you agree with this. Should it be the case that the GM is biased in favor of the players because they're heroic, or should the GM be biased in favor of the players because they're players, right? They're the superstars, they're the star of the movie, right? I mean, in Savage Worlds, they make this explicit. Your characters, the wild cards, get to roll extra dice and stuff, and most of their enemies are extras, right? Literally extras in the movie sense. They're just, people who are in one scene or two scenes and then they're out, right? They're not the stars. And so, it could also be argued that it's not really about goodwill or about whether the player characters are heroic or not. It's about the fact that they're the protagonist, they're the star of the movie, and so the movie star usually gets to succeed, right? And so you could interpret it that way as well, I guess. So leave comments and let me know, is it because they're the star? Is it because they're heroic? Maybe it's neither one. Maybe you're going to say, no, screw that. The GM should be completely neutral and not worry about setting up challenges that are designed for the players to win at them. Too bad. The challenge is the challenge. And, if the first level characters end up fighting frost giants, then they end up fighting frost giants. That's just too bad. I don't necessarily agree with that one. I think that, it's a lot more fun when the challenge is appropriate so that it's difficult but within your means to defeat, right? Versus a challenge that is way out of your range, either too easily, right? It's too easy for you, or too hard, right? There's kind of a sweet spot for challenges, and as a game master, I try to hit that where it's hard but doable, right? If you use your noggin, if you use your mind and you're smart, this particular challenge, whatever it is hard but doable. And then it's just a question of being clever about it, right? And I think, most game design is like that, right? Where you're trying to design a challenge that is good for the player, but not too, it's tough enough to be a challenge and therefore fun on that basis, right? The fun of the challenge. But it's not so hard that the person is pulling their hair out, right? The players are pulling their hair out trying to do it, right? That isn't a lot of fun. This game, for example, it starts you out with fairly easy cleaning challenges, and then as you go along, you get more difficult ones. What's going on here with the interior of this roof? Is it done? No. So, for example, when we started out, we were just doing the car, right? And then now we're doing this backyard. And then what's going to happen is eventually you're doing like a whole house, right? The whole outside of the house. And it becomes more difficult. You get access to more advanced cleaning equipment, and you have to make some different choices. For example, you can get, I don't think I can do it yet, but you can get detergent, and you can add soap to the mix. Yeah, they don't even have the option yet. You can add soap to the mix, and then they have cleaning agents, right? And they have different cleaning agents for different surfaces. So stone versus multi-purpose versus wood. There are all these different possible cleaning surfaces, and you need different attachments, and especially different types of detergent for each one, right? But they don't give that to you right at the beginning because you're still trying to figure out the basics of how to control the nozzle and everything, right? And it's only after you've done that for a while that they then give you a cleaning situation where you're going to need to have the detergent, right? But that you don't need that here. It's just water, and it works fine, right? So what's with the doghouse roof? Oh, I know. I gotta crouch down, I bet. Right there. What am I missing here? There we go. So guys, I think that's probably where I'm going to stop. That the GM should not be neutral, but should be on the side of the player characters. And I'll finish up this yard, and I will bring you back. I'll pause it here, and I'll bring you back when everything's clean so you can see how it looks all cleaned up. Until next time, then, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Let's Rant with Scrapper using Power Wash Simulator. Alright folks, we are back just so you can see the finished product. All I have left to do is this last edging, and that will finish everything, but I figured before we do, because once it's done, you can't walk around. You can take a look if you remember what it used to look like. The birdhouse is clean, the trellis is clean, cleaned up this whole pond. Patio's clean, the stepping stones, the fences, and this thing, the patio table, this fence. Everything's all cleaned up, and we just have to do this last flower bed, and then we are finished. So it's looking pretty good. And the job is complete. So there is the time lapse. And that is the end of this episode of Let's Rant with Scrapperlock using Power Wash Simulator. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and I will see you then.